The Battle of the Atlantic was not merely a campaign of ships and submarines, it was the heartbeat of the Second World War. Stretching from the first day of the conflict in 1939 to the final weeks of 1945, it became the longest continuous military engagement in modern history. Across this vast, shifting theater of ocean, men fought and died in conditions of unimaginable isolation and peril. The German U-boat fleet, or Unterseebootswaffe, stood at the center of this struggle, seeking to strangle Britain's maritime lifelines and starve the Allied war effort into submission. What began as a strategic gamble evolved into a war of endurance, waged in the depths of the Atlantic, where technology, intelligence, and human courage collided in a contest that would ultimately decide the fate of Europe. To understand the nature of German submarine warfare in the Atlantic, one must begin with geography and necessity. Britain, an island nation dependent on imported food, raw materials, and fuel, was uniquely vulnerable to maritime blockade. Its survival hinged upon the steady flow of merchant convoys from North America and the colonies. Germany, unable to match the Royal Navy's dominance in surface fleets, sought an asymmetric weapon, one that could bypass the might of battleships and aircraft carriers and strike at the arteries of global trade. The submarine, stealthy and lethal, offered precisely that. The First World War had already revealed the potential of the U-boat as a weapon of economic warfare. During that earlier conflict, German submarines had come perilously close to forcing Britain to capitulate through unrestricted submarine attacks, only to be restrained by international outrage after incidents such as the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. When the Second World War began, the lessons of that earlier campaign were not forgotten. To Adolf Hitler's naval planners, the Atlantic presented both a threat and an opportunity. If Britain could be cut off from its supplies, the war in the West might be won without an invasion. At the heart of this vision stood Admiral Karl Donitz, a career submariner whose strategic foresight and relentless energy transformed the U-boat arm into a formidable weapon. Donitz believed that the key to victory lay in the concentrated use of submarines against merchant convoys. Rather than operating individually, as they had during the previous war, U-boats would hunt in coordinated packs, Rudel, or wolf packs, striking under cover of darkness to overwhelm convoy defenses. It was a doctrine born of mathematical precision and psychological insight. Donitz understood that Britain's survival depended not on the number of ships afloat, but on tonnage, the amount of cargo arriving safely each month. If his submarines could sink faster than the Allies could build, Britain's war effort would collapse. Thus, the Battle of the Atlantic became not a war of annihilation, but a war of attrition, measured in tons of shipping lost and lives consumed in the cold depths of the ocean. The early years of the campaign brought spectacular success for the Germans. When war erupted in September 1939, Germany possessed only 57 operational U-boats, far fewer than Donitz had deemed necessary. Yet these few vessels proved devastatingly effective. Exploiting Britain's initial lack of preparedness and the absence of coordinated convoy protection, U-boats roamed the North Atlantic with near impunity. The first happy time, as the Germans called it, saw dozens of ships sunk each month, their wrecks littering the shipping lanes. The fall of France in 1940 gave Germany access to Atlantic ports such as Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire, extending the reach of its submarine fleet deep into the Western Ocean. From these fortified bases, U-boats could strike across the convoy routes to Canada, the United States, and the Caribbean, turning the Atlantic into a vast killing ground. But the war at sea was never static. For every innovation by one side, the other responded with new tactics, technologies, and intelligence efforts. The Allies, initially slow to adapt, gradually forged a defense network built upon cooperation, science, and sheer endurance. The reintroduction of the convoy system, supported by corvettes, destroyers, and later escort carriers, began to turn the tide. Radar and sonar, then known as ASDIC, allowed escorts to detect submerged submarines. Depth charges and later the Hedgehog anti-submarine weapon gave them new offensive power. Air patrols extended the reach of surveillance, denying U-boats the surface access they needed to recharge batteries and coordinate attacks. The invisible became visible. The hunters were being hunted. Still, technology alone did not explain the eventual Allied triumph. Intelligence, particularly the breaking of the German Enigma code, played a decisive role. In the unassuming huts of Bletchley Park in England, teams of mathematicians, linguists, and engineers labored in secrecy to decipher German communications. The fruits of their labor, codenamed Ultra, allowed Allied commanders to anticipate U-boat movements and divert convoys away from danger. Although the Germans continuously refined their encryption methods, the Allied cryptanalysts stayed one step ahead, turning the tide of the Atlantic War from uncertainty to calculated precision. This secret triumph, hidden from the public for decades, saved countless lives and transformed the nature of modern warfare. Yet the battle was not fought solely with machines and codes. It was a struggle of endurance, waged by men who lived and died in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. For the U-boat crews, life beneath the Atlantic was a mixture of monotony, terror, and fatalism. Cramped inside metal tubes for weeks or months, surrounded by the stench of diesel fuel and sweat, they faced constant danger from depth charges and aerial attack. The psychological strain was immense. Each dive could be their last, each patrol a descent into isolation. Their enemy was not only the Royal Navy, but the ocean itself, its pressure, its darkness, its unrelenting cold. And yet, despite these hardships, the submariners fought with discipline and courage. They saw themselves as an elite brotherhood, bound by duty and belief in a mission that promised to reshape the world. For the Allied sailors, merchant and naval alike, the experience was equally grueling. The men of the merchant marine, often civilians with minimal training, braved the same dangers without the protection of armor or weaponry. Their ships were slow and vulnerable, carrying the fuel, food, and ammunition that sustained the Allied war effort. When torpedoes struck, they had little chance of survival. Many froze in the icy waters before rescue could arrive. Despite this, the convoys kept sailing, a testament to human resilience and determination. By 1943, the momentum of the war had begun to shift decisively. The combination of improved technology, air coverage, and intelligence turned the Atlantic from a fronting ground into a trap for U-boats. That year marked the decisive turning point, sometimes called Black May, when the German submarine fleet suffered catastrophic losses. In a single month, over 40 U-boats were destroyed, forcing Donitz to withdraw his remaining forces from the North Atlantic. The hunters had become the hunted. Although Germany continued to produce new submarines, including the advanced Type 21 Electro boat, they arrived too late to alter the course of the war. The Atlantic, once the domain of German ambition, now belonged firmly to the Allies. The defeat of the U-boat campaign carried far-reaching consequences. Strategically, it ensured the survival of Britain and paved the way for the Allied invasion of Europe. Without secure sea lanes, Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings of June 1944, would have been impossible. The victory at sea enabled the transfer of troops, weapons, and supplies on a scale unprecedented in history. The Battle of the Atlantic, though fought largely in the shadows, made the liberation of Europe possible. It was, as Churchill later said, the dominating factor throughout the war. Had the U-boat succeeded, the story of the 20th century might have been written very differently. In the aftermath of the war, the U-boat legacy lingered, a mixture of awe, tragedy, and technological admiration. The submariners had fought with exceptional courage, but their sacrifice had been in vain. Nearly 40,000 of the 50,000 men who served in U-boats perished at sea, making it one of the most fatal branches of any armed force in history. In the early years of the 20th century, Germany's naval ambitions transformed from mere aspiration into a defining element of its strategic identity. The German Empire, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, envisioned a maritime force that could challenge the centuries-old supremacy of the British Royal Navy. This dream was both a reflection of national pride and a practical necessity for a country that sought a global empire. Yet beneath the surface of this grand vision lay a secret weapon that would come to redefine the very nature of warfare at sea: the submarine, or as the Germans called it, the Unterseeboot, the U-boat. When the First World War erupted in 1914, the German Navy found itself outmatched by the Royal Navy's sheer numbers and reach. Germany's surface fleet, though modern and formidable, was bottled up in the North Sea. Unable to break Britain's naval blockade or challenge its control of maritime routes directly, German strategists turned to the U-boat as an asymmetric countermeasure. Submarines could slip through the blockade undetected, disrupt supply lines, and strike at Britain's economic lifeline, the merchant convoys carrying food, fuel, and materials from across the Empire and the Americas. By 1915, U-boats had begun to transform the Atlantic into a perilous battleground. Their stealth and lethal torpedoes brought the war directly to civilian shipping, blurring the line between military and non-combatant targets. The sinking of the British liner RMS Lusitania in May 1915, with the loss of 1,198 lives, including 128 Americans, shocked the world and turned public opinion against Germany. Despite diplomatic fallout, Berlin continued to gamble on submarine warfare as a decisive weapon. For Germany, it was a question of survival: starve Britain into submission or be strangled by the blockade. The end of World War I brought the collapse of the German U-boat arm, but not the idea of submarine supremacy. The Treaty of Versailles banned Germany from possessing submarines, yet the vision of undersea warfare remained alive within the Reichsmarine's secret planning. During the 1920s and early 1930s, German naval officers quietly studied the lessons of the previous conflict, often collaborating with sympathetic powers such as the Soviet Union to test designs and train crews. When Adolf Hitler came to power in 1933, he openly defied the Versailles restrictions, and by 1935, Germany launched a new generation of U-boats under the newly established Kriegsmarine. The interwar years saw rapid technological innovation. U-boats became faster, more reliable, and capable of operating farther from base. Germany's naval command, led by Grand Admiral Erich Raeder and later by the ambitious Karl Donitz, saw U-boats not merely as tools of harassment, but as strategic weapons that could cripple Britain's war economy. Donitz, a veteran U-boat officer from the First World War, championed the idea that a concentrated fleet of submarines could overwhelm Allied defenses and severed the Atlantic lifeline. He calculated that 300 operational U-boats could bring Britain to its knees, a figure that became the guiding vision for Germany's naval buildup on the eve of World War II. When war broke out again in September 1939, Germany possessed fewer than 60 operational U-boats, far short of Donitz's goal. Yet the Kriegsmarine wasted no time in launching its campaign. The early months of the conflict, known as the First Happy Time, saw dramatic successes as U-boats prowled the North Atlantic, the North Sea, and the western approaches. Operating largely independently, they targeted merchant ships with devastating effect. Britain, once again, found itself dependent on overseas imports for survival, and once again, German submarines sought to choke that lifeline. The strategic gamble of the U-boat campaign was rooted in a clear understanding of Britain's vulnerabilities. An island nation dependent on maritime trade, Britain could not sustain its industry, population, or military without access to raw materials and food. German planners believed that by cutting off these supplies, Britain would be forced to negotiate peace before the United States could intervene decisively. It was a race against time and tonnage, one that would define the Battle of the Atlantic for years to come. However, the early successes masked deeper challenges. The U-boat arm faced logistical constraints, limited bases, and an over-reliance on a small cadre of experienced commanders. The loss of even a few submarines could cripple operations. Moreover, Britain's defensive measures began to evolve. The reintroduction of the convoy system, combined with improved sonar, ASDIC, and air patrols gradually reduced U-boat effectiveness. But in 1940 and 1941, the tide still seemed to favor Germany. The fall of France gave the Kriegsmarine access to Atlantic ports like Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, extending U-boat range and shortening transit times. From these bases, wolfpacks could now strike deep into the Atlantic, threatening shipping lanes from Newfoundland to Gibraltar. For Germany, this expansion marked the high point of its naval confidence. Hitler, despite his initial skepticism toward naval investment, came to view the U-boat campaign as a means to force Britain to its knees without a costly invasion. Dönitz continued to refine his tactics, emphasizing coordination, radio communication, and night attacks. But every success carried the seeds of future vulnerability. The same radio signals that allowed U-boats to coordinate also exposed them to Allied interception. The Allies, through organizations like Bletchley Park, were already working tirelessly to break the Enigma cipher that encoded U-boat communications, a breakthrough that would later prove decisive. By the end of 1941, Germany's U-boats had sunk millions of tons of Allied shipping, and morale among the submariners ran high. They were celebrated as heroes of the Reich, the gray wolves who hunted unseen beneath the waves. But the strategic gamble was far from won. The entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 opened vast new hunting grounds for U-boats along the American eastern seaboard. Initially, the Americans were unprepared for the threat, and German submarines reaped another period of success, the so-called Second Happy Time. Yet the industrial and technological might of the Allies was awakening. The battle that had begun as Germany's bold undersea gamble was about to become a relentless war of attrition. Thus, the rise of the U-boat threat was both a product of innovation and desperation. It embodied Germany's belief that asymmetric warfare could compensate for inferiority in surface strength. It also reflected a broader theme of 20th century conflict, the struggle to control the invisible domains of war, where technology, intelligence, and endurance determined victory. As the Battle of the Atlantic deepened, the U-boat would become not only a weapon of terror, but a symbol of industrial total war, a dark and silent force that tested the courage of men above and below the waves. As the Second World War intensified, the German U-boat campaign evolved from an opportunistic assault on merchant shipping into a highly organized system of coordinated warfare. At the heart of this transformation was the Rudel tactic, the wolfpack strategy, a concept born from both necessity and innovation. The architect of this approach was Admiral Karl Dönitz, a career submariner whose experience and vision reshaped undersea warfare. Dönitz recognized that lone U-boats, the wolfpack strategy was simple in theory but complex in execution. Instead of sending individual U-boats to prowl the ocean in isolation, Dönitz proposed deploying groups of submarines along patrol lines across key convoy routes. When one U-boat sighted a convoy, it would shadow the enemy formation, relaying its position to headquarters via encrypted radio. Dönitz's command would then direct nearby U-boats to converge on the target. The tactical advantage of this method lay in numbers and coordination. While a single U-boat could launch only a handful of torpedoes before being forced to dive and evade, multiple submarines attacking simultaneously could overwhelm a convoy's escorts and spread panic among merchant crews. At night, with visibility low and radar still in its infancy, U-boats could surface and use their diesel engines to maneuver quickly, presenting small silhouettes against the dark waves. The submariners, during 1940 and 1941, this approach reached its deadly zenith. Operating from bases along the French Atlantic coast at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and Brest, U-boat flotillas extended their reach deep into the Atlantic. The fall of France had given Dönitz the geographic advantage he needed: ports closer to convoy lanes and better access to the open sea. From these strongholds, packs of U-boats fanned out into the mid-Atlantic, a region grimly nicknamed the Black Pit. Each U-boat in a wolf pack typically carried a complement of 40 to 50 men, living in cramped, humid conditions that tested endurance as much as courage. Patrols could last several weeks, during which the men subsisted on tinned food and stale air, enduring constant anxiety from the threat of depth charges. The atmosphere aboard was claustrophobic yet disciplined, a blend of professionalism and fatalism. U-boat crews developed a distinct esprit de corps. At the operational level, communication was key. Messages were sent in coded bursts using the Enigma cipher machine, which the Germans considered unbreakable. These transmissions allowed Dönitz's command center, known as the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote (BDU), to orchestrate attacks with precision. Yet this dependence on radio also carried a fatal flaw. It made the U-boats traceable. Each transmission, though encrypted, could be detected by Allied direction-finding equipment. Nevertheless, in the early years of the campaign, the wolf packs achieved devastating success. Allied convoys suffered catastrophic losses, with ships torpedoed in rapid succession, their cargoes of oil, food, and ammunition sent to the ocean floor. Survivors often floated for days before rescue, haunted by the suddenness of their ordeal. The U-boat commanders, men like Günther Prien, Otto Kretschmer, and Joachim Schepke, became national heroes in Germany, celebrated in propaganda films. The psychological impact of the Wolfpack attacks extended beyond the immediate destruction. Merchant sailors described the terror of watching torpedoes streak through the water, the shock of explosions tearing ships apart, and the eerie glow of burning oil slicks illuminating the night sea. For the Allies, it seemed that the ocean itself had turned hostile, an invisible predator lurking beneath the waves. The Royal Navy and the Merchant Marine found themselves locked in a war of nerves. By 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had become a contest of endurance and adaptation. The Americans, newly drawn into the war, initially failed to grasp the full extent of the U-boat threat. Along the U.S. East Coast, German submarines hunted with near impunity in what became known as the Second Happy Time. City lights from coastal towns silhouetted ships against the horizon, making them easy targets. Tankers and freighters burned offshore, while bathers on American beaches watched helplessly. But success carried its own perils. The more the U-boats relied on coordinated attacks, the more predictable their methods became. Allied intelligence, aided by improved radio interception and code-breaking efforts, began to anticipate the movements of wolf packs. The convoy escorts, destroyers, corvettes, and armed trawlers, grew more experienced and better equipped. Depth charges became more effective, sonar improved, and aircraft coverage expanded. Still, for much of 1942, the Wolfpack remained a formidable weapon. The scale of destruction was staggering. Hundreds of merchant ships were sunk, and vital supplies to Britain dwindled. Donitz's belief in concentrated submarine warfare seemed vindicated. Yet cracks were beginning to show. The U-boat fleet, though technologically advanced for its time, could not replace losses as quickly as the Allies could replace ships. Germany's shipyards struggled under the strain of Allied bombing and material shortages. The Wolfpack strategy also revealed the inherent paradox of submarine warfare. Success depended on stealth, yet coordination demanded communication. As the Allies refined their ability to detect and decrypt radio messages, the advantage began to shift. Moreover, advances in radar and the introduction of long-range aircraft, notably the consolidated B-24 Liberator, closed the deadly Black Pit. U-boats that once roamed freely now faced constant surveillance from above. Night attacks became riskier. By 1943, the tide was turning decisively. The same tactical brilliance that had made the Wolfpack effective was now a liability. Donitz, though still revered among his men, found himself fighting a losing battle against superior Allied technology and industrial output. The Wolfpacks continued to strike, but their losses mounted catastrophically. What had begun as a bold innovation, a revolutionary form of undersea coordination, had evolved into a desperate struggle for survival. The hunters had become, yet the legacy of the Wolfpack endures as a testament to both human ingenuity and the brutality of total war. It demonstrated how tactical cooperation could transform a handful of submarines into a force capable of threatening entire nations. But it also revealed the limits of technology when confronted with adaptive enemies and superior resources. By the beginning of 1942, the Battle of the Atlantic had reached its darkest and most perilous phase for the Allied powers. The German U-boat fleet, emboldened by its earlier triumphs and operating from its new Atlantic bases, was waging an unrelenting campaign against Allied shipping. Merchant vessels carrying food, fuel, and weapons were being sunk at a catastrophic rate. The Atlantic Ocean, once the vital artery connecting the New World with the Old, the convoy system, first revived during the early stages of the war, was Britain's primary defense against the submarine menace. The idea was simple. Merchant ships traveled together in large groups, protected by naval escorts. These convoys were organized into numbered series, each following designated routes that minimized exposure to U-boat patrol lines. In theory, this system offered mutual protection. In practice, it demanded coordination on a scale unprecedented in naval history. At first, the convoy escorts were too few and too poorly equipped to repel determined U-boat assaults. Destroyers and corvettes, though fast and maneuverable, often lacked the endurance to patrol the vast expanses of the Atlantic. Escort carriers and long-range aircraft were scarce, leaving large gaps in air cover where submarines could strike at will. These gaps, particularly in the mid-Atlantic, became known as the Black Pit, a region where the convoys were most vulnerable. It was here. The crisis deepened in 1942 and early 1943, as the U-boats extended their operations into the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. Tankers carrying vital oil from Venezuela and the United States were torpedoed within sight of shore. Entire convoys disappeared into the depths, their positions marked only by oil slicks and debris. For the Allied navies, the strain was immense. Every ship lost meant not only the loss of cargo, but also the loss of trained seamen and valuable escort vessels. The success of the U-boats was due not only to superior tactics, but also to the ingenuity of their commanders. Many of them, like Otto Kretschmer, Erich Topp, and Reinhard Hartigan, became legends in their own right. They stalked their prey with patience and precision, often shadowing convoys for days before striking. Attacks were timed for maximum effect, usually in the early hours before dawn when visibility was at its worst. U-boat captains learned to exploit the convoy's defensive weaknesses. To the men aboard the merchant ships, the Atlantic crossing was a test of endurance and courage. The merchant mariners, civilians by training, faced dangers equal to those of combat soldiers. Life aboard a freighter was a constant battle against fear, exhaustion, and the elements. The sound of a distant explosion could mean another ship had been hit. The flash of a flare might signal a desperate call for help. Convoy discipline demanded that ships maintain formation even when attacked. For Britain, the stakes could not have been higher. By 1941, the island nation was importing over half its food and most of its oil by sea. The loss of these supplies threatened not just the war effort, but the survival of the population itself. Prime Minister Winston Churchill later confessed that the U-boat war was the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire conflict. The Ministry of Shipping and the Admiralty worked feverishly to organize convoys, reroute shipping. In response to mounting losses, the Allies began to improve both organization and technology. The establishment of the Western Approaches Command in Liverpool created a centralized nerve center for coordinating convoy defenses. Admiral Sir Max Horton, who took command in 1942, introduced a more aggressive approach to anti-submarine warfare. Rather than merely defending the convoys, escorts were encouraged to hunt U-boats actively, using improved sonar and depth charges to destroy them. The introduction of new escort vessels, such as the Flower-class corvette and the River-class frigate, helped close the gap in convoy protection. These ships, though smaller and slower than destroyers, were ideal for long-range patrols and could stay with convoys across the Atlantic. The growing use of escort carriers also transformed the balance of power. Aircraft from these small carriers could spot U-boats on the surface and attack them with bombs or depth charges before they could dive. Yet, even as the Allies improved their defenses, the crisis of the convoys reached a breaking point in early 1943. In March of that year, the Battle of the Atlantic hung in the balance. The convoy battles of ONS 167 and HX 229 became symbols of the struggle's intensity. Over several days of savage fighting, more than 20 Allied ships were sunk by coordinated wolfpack attacks. The scale of the losses alarmed Allied leaders and threatened to cripple Britain's ability to sustain the war. For a time, what saved the Allies from disaster was not any single innovation, but the cumulative effect of organization, technology, and endurance. The integration of air cover, improved radar, and more effective depth charge tactics began to turn the tide. Long-range aircraft such as the B-24 Liberator and the Sunderland flying boat closed the air gap, forcing U-boats to remain submerged for longer periods and reducing their effectiveness. New weapons like the Hedgehog, a forward-throwing anti-submarine mortar. The human cost of the convoy crisis was staggering. Tens of thousands of sailors, merchant and naval alike, lost their lives in the icy waters of the Atlantic. The crews of both sides endured unimaginable conditions. Claustrophobic submarines stalked the depths, while sailors on the surface braved freezing seas and constant fear. Yet, out of this crucible of suffering emerged a sense of shared determination. The Battle of the Atlantic was not just a struggle for control of sea lanes. By mid-1943, the situation began to improve noticeably. U-boat losses mounted at an unsustainable rate, while Allied shipbuilding surpassed even the worst destruction. Convoy routes became better protected, and the once deadly Atlantic crossing grew gradually safer. The crisis of the convoys, though not far from over, was passing. The Allies had endured the storm and emerged stronger for it. The German U-boat fleet, once feared and seemingly invincible, now faced a new reality. The crisis of the convoys represented the heart of the Battle of the Atlantic, a vast, grinding struggle of endurance, innovation, and sacrifice. It tested the resolve of nations and the courage of individuals who fought not for glory, but for survival. Every convoy that reached port carried not only cargo, but also the hope of victory. And every ship lost was a reminder of the high price of freedom on the open sea. The Atlantic War had entered its decisive phase. By the spring of 1943, the long and brutal struggle for control of the Atlantic had reached a critical turning point. For nearly 4 years, the German U-boat fleet had terrorized Allied shipping, threatening to starve Britain into submission and choke off the vital flow of men and materials across the ocean. Yet beneath the surface of this vast maritime conflict, another, quieter war had been raging, a war of intelligence, mathematics, and machines. The foundation of the Allied intelligence effort lay in the relentless pursuit of one objective: to break the German Enigma code. The Enigma machine, a complex electromechanical cipher device used by the German military, allowed operators to scramble messages into millions of possible combinations. Each day, the settings of the machine were changed according to secret key lists, making the task of decryption seem impossible. Yet the Allies knew that without penetrating this wall of secrecy, the story of Enigma's defeat began even before the outbreak of the war. In the 1930s, Polish cryptanalysts, led by Marian Rejewski, Jerzy Ruzicki, and Henryk Zagalski, made the first breakthrough by reconstructing the logic of the Enigma machine. Using mathematical analysis and early computational techniques, they built the Bomba Cryptologica, a device capable of deciphering messages under certain conditions. When Poland was invaded in 1939, at Bletchley Park, a sprawling Victorian mansion in Buckinghamshire, a remarkable assembly of minds was gathered to take on the monumental challenge of breaking Enigma on an industrial scale. Mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and chess champions worked side by side in utmost secrecy. Among them was Alan Turing, the mathematical prodigy whose work would revolutionize both cryptography and computing. The ability to read German naval signals, codenamed Ultra, transformed the Battle of the Atlantic. For the first time, Allied commanders could anticipate U-boat movements and redirect convoys away from danger. Intelligence derived from decrypted messages was carefully distributed to naval commands through a tightly controlled system to avoid revealing the source. Ultra-intelligence became a decisive weapon, not through force, but through foresight. However, the battle for information was far from straightforward. The Germans continuously refined their encryption methods, introducing the more complex four-rotor Enigma in 1942, which temporarily blinded Allied cryptanalysts. For months, convoy losses surged, as U-boats once again roamed with impunity. Only through a combination of captured codebooks, recovered Enigma machines, and relentless analytical work did Bletchley Park regain the upper hand. While intelligence offered foresight, technology delivered the tools to act on it. The Allies invested heavily in radar, sonar, and weapons that could neutralize the U-boat menace. Radar technology advanced rapidly during the war, with the introduction of centimeter wavelength sets that could detect submarine conning towers even in rough seas. Airborne radar, mounted on long-range patrol aircraft such as the Liberator and the Sunderland, extended detection capabilities far into the Atlantic. The development of the lifeline, a powerful searchlight mounted beneath aircraft, turned night into day for patrolling aircrews. When radar detected a surfaced submarine, the aircraft would approach undetected until the final moments, then illuminate the target with the blinding beam of the lifeline and unleash bombs or death charges. This innovation shattered the U-boat's previous advantage of attacking convoys under the cover of darkness. What had once been their shield became their downfall. Sonar, known at the time as ASDIC, also became a crucial component of the anti-submarine arsenal. By sending sound pulses through the water and listening for echoes, escorts could locate submarines hiding below the surface. Early sonar had limitations. It could detect a U-boat's position, but not its depth, and it was easily disrupted by rough seas or evasive maneuvers. But as the war progressed, sonar systems improved and new tactics evolved. Escort vessels began to coordinate their attacks. Another technological breakthrough was the development of the Hedgehog, an anti-submarine mortar that fired a pattern of small explosives ahead of the attacking ship. Unlike depth charges, which detonated at preset depths, hedgehog bombs exploded only upon contact with a submarine's hull, increasing the chances of a kill while allowing escorts to maintain sonar contact. This innovation shattered the U-boat's previous advantage of attacking convoys under the cover of darkness. What had once been their shield became their downfall. Sonar, known at the time as ASDIC, also became a crucial component of the anti-submarine arsenal. By sending sound pulses through the water and listening for echoes, escorts could locate submarines hiding below the surface. Early sonar had limitations. It could detect a U-boat's position, but not its depth, and it was easily disrupted by rough seas or evasive maneuvers. But as the war progressed, sonar systems improved and new tactics evolved. Escort vessels began to coordinate their attacks. Another technological breakthrough was the development of the Hedgehog, an anti-submarine mortar that fired a pattern of small explosives ahead of the attacking ship. Unlike depth charges, which detonated at preset depths, Hedgehog bombs exploded only upon contact with a submarine's hull, increasing the chances of a kill while allowing escorts to maintain sonar contact. This weapon, combined with improved coordination among escort groups, turned the tide in the Atlantic. The synergy between intelligence and technology became the key to Allied success. Convoy escorts were now guided not only by radar and sonar, but by intelligence from Bletchley Park. The flow of decrypted information allowed Allied headquarters to position hunter-killer groups along predicted U-boat routes. Long-range aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic gap, denying submarines the sanctuary they had once enjoyed. The sea, which had once favored the stealth of the hunters, had now turned against them. By mid-1943, the cumulative effect of these advances became undeniable. U-boat losses skyrocketed, with entire wolf packs annihilated before they could inflict serious damage. In May 1943 alone, 41 U-boats were destroyed, a catastrophic toll that forced Dönitz to withdraw his remaining forces temporarily from the North Atlantic. For the first time since the war began, the Allies could claim to have gained control of the sea lanes. The convoy system, once a desperate defense, had now become an effective tool of war. Still, victory in the intelligence war was achieved at immense human cost. The work at Bletchley Park was grueling, repetitive, and shrouded in secrecy. Thousands of men and women labored around the clock, their contributions hidden from public view. The codebreakers lived under constant pressure, aware that every delay or mistake could cost hundreds of lives at sea. Many never spoke of their achievements, bound by oaths of secrecy that lasted decades after the war's end. The Germans, for their part, never fully realized the extent to which their communications had been compromised. They attributed the growing Allied success to radar and luck rather than to broken codes. Dönitz, though suspicious at times, could not bring himself to believe that the Enigma system had been penetrated. This miscalculation allowed the Allies to exploit ultra-intelligence until the war's final days. The quiet victory of the codebreakers, combined with relentless technological innovation. By late 1943 and early 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had irrevocably shifted in the Allies' favor. The only once invincible U-boat fleet was now hunted, tracked, and destroyed with increasing efficiency. German crews faced dwindling morale, high casualties, and a sense of inevitability. The hunters who had once ruled the ocean depths now operated under constant threat. The sea had turned against them, as every innovation, every radar pulse, every sonar echo made the waters dangerous. The breaking of the Enigma code and the technological triumphs that followed did more than win a battle. They symbolized the dawning of a new era in warfare. The Battle of the Atlantic was no longer a struggle of ships and torpedoes alone, but of information, machines, and intellect. The victory of intelligence and technology over brute force marked a turning point not only in the war, but in the history of modern conflict. It was here, in the invisible realm of signals and circuits. By the beginning of 1944, the U-boat arm of the German Kriegsmarine was facing an existential crisis. The years of dominance in the Atlantic were over. The hunters, once feared as the scourge of Allied convoys, had become the hunted. The relentless advance of Allied technology, intelligence, and production had turned the tide irreversibly. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the tireless commander of the U-boat fleet, now found himself presiding over a campaign that had lost its strategic purpose and was being ground down by attrition. The scale of destruction faced by the U-boat arm was staggering. In 1943 alone, 237 German submarines were destroyed, more than the total number that had been operational at the start of the war. For every merchant ship sunk, the cost in men and materiel became unbearable. The training pipeline that once produced elite crews could no longer keep pace with losses. By late 1944, most U-boat sailors were young, barely trained, and entering a war they had little hope of surviving. The changing balance of power at sea reflected not just Allied superiority, but German overextension. Dönitz had long argued for a concentrated submarine campaign focused on Britain. But Hitler's strategic priorities shifted repeatedly. Resources were diverted to other theaters, and the grand promise of the U-boat blockade faded into desperation. As Allied forces advanced across Europe and bombers devastated German shipyards, the production of new submarines struggled to continue. Even the innovative Type 21, known as the Electro boat, represented the zenith of German submarine design, a vessel years ahead of its time. It featured streamlined hulls, greater underwater speed, and enhanced battery capacity, allowing it to remain submerged for extended periods. It was the first true submarine in the modern sense, designed to operate beneath the surface rather than merely submerge for attack. However, its arrival came too late. The Allies' overwhelming air and naval dominance made it impossible to